In the dark heart of the Third Reich's intelligence apparatus, there existed a dangerous form of collective blindness. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, considered itself the supreme master of the European chessboard. To Hitler and his inner circle, the British were nothing more than a fading empire of gentlemen amateurs, capable of small-time sabotage, perhaps, but far too honorable and rigid to execute a truly grand deception. This was the first and most fatal German mistake. They projected their own rigid logic onto an enemy that had become masters of the shadows. In London, within the windowless rooms of the Admiralty, a group of brilliant, eccentric minds understood this German arrogance perfectly. They knew that a German officer wouldn't believe a simple lie, but he would bet his life on a complex truth that he believed he had discovered through his own superior intellect. They decided to give the Führer exactly what his ego craved, a secret so monumental that it would blind him to the reality of the war. But this secret wouldn't be delivered by a spy or a traitor. It would be carried into the heart of the Reich by a man who no longer had a heartbeat. They were about to launch a mission that relied not on bullets, but on the macabre theater of a dead man walking. The operation was codenamed Mincemeat, a name as cold and clinical as the plan itself. The task was to take a nameless corpse, a homeless man named Glinder Michael who had died in the shadows of London, and transform him into a hero of the British Empire. This wasn't just about a fake uniform, it was about creating a soul. For weeks, British intelligence officers Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley lived as if they were Major William Martin. They didn't just write a biography, they built a life out of paper and ink. They filled his pockets with the pocket litter of a living man, a letter from an overdrawn bank account, a bill for a new shirt, stubs from a London theater, and most importantly, the heart-wrenching correspondence from a fictional fiancée named Pam. They even included a photograph of Pam, actually a secretary from MI5, and a receipt for a diamond engagement ring. The detail was obsessive because they knew the German Abwehr was obsessive. They knew that when the body washed ashore, German scientists would analyze every fiber of his clothing and every word in his wallet. They weren't just forging a soldier, they were forging a reality so detailed that the German mind, in its love for meticulous data, would find it impossible to doubt. They were betting everything on the idea that the Nazis would be so busy looking at the engagement ring that they would miss the dagger aimed at their throat. The crown jewel of this elaborate ruse was a black leather briefcase, securely fastened to the dead man's wrist by a sturdy chain. To any casual observer, it was the equipment of a high-level courier, but inside lay the golden bait, letters marked personal and most secret between the highest-ranking generals in the British military. These weren't crude maps with "attack here" written on them. They were masterpieces of subtle suggestion. The letters spoke of a plan to strike at the Balkans and Greece, referring to the inevitable invasion of Sicily as a mere cover, a feint designed to trick the Germans. The British knew that Hitler was already paranoid about the Balkans, fearing for his vital oil supplies in Romania. They played on his existing fears like a virtuoso on a violin. They made sure the language was casual, the kind of shop talk between elite generals that felt authentic and unscripted. They gambled that the Germans would feel a rush of adrenaline at stealing such high-level secrets. The briefcase was the ultimate Trojan horse, designed to be found on a Spanish beach, leaked by pro-Nazi officials, and flown directly to the Führer's desk. It was a message from a dead man to a dictator, and it was carrying the death warrant of the German defenses in the Mediterranean. In the early hours of April 30th, 1943, the British submarine Seraph surfaced in the cold Atlantic waters off the coast of Huelva, Spain. The crew, told only that they were deploying top-secret weather equipment, watched as their commander pushed a canister into the sea. Inside was Major Martin, encased in dry ice. As the tides carried the body toward the shore, the British launched a second, equally important phase of the deception, the frantic search. They sent urgent, top-secret cables to their diplomats in Spain, demanding the immediate return of the briefcase, emphasizing its extreme sensitivity. They knew the Spanish authorities, heavily influenced by the Gestapo, would intercept these messages. This panic was the final proof the Germans needed. When the body was discovered by a local sardine fisherman, the German agents in Spain moved like sharks scenting blood. They pressured the local doctors, bypassed the usual protocols, and managed to get their hands on the documents just long enough to photograph every single page. They believed they were witnessing a monumental British failure, a lucky break that would change the course of the war. In reality, every move they made was being choreographed from a basement in London. The Germans thought they had caught the British in a moment of weakness. They had no idea they had just swallowed a lethal dose of misinformation.
When the translated documents finally arrived at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secluded headquarters in East Prussia, they were greeted not with skepticism, but with a sense of divine providence. Hitler had always considered himself a man of Vorsprung, a leader with an almost mystical intuition. For months, he had been arguing with his generals about where the Allied blow would fall. Many, including the brilliant Erwin Rommel, pointed to Sicily as the only logical target. But Hitler, influenced by the Mincemeat papers, now had proof that his generals were wrong and he was right. He became obsessed with the defense of Greece and Sardinia. He viewed the documents as a window into the very soul of the Allied High Command. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years convinced of German intellectual superiority, and this bias now became their greatest vulnerability. Hitler didn't just read the papers, he championed them. He silenced any staff officer who dared to question how a briefcase could remain so perfectly preserved after a journey at sea. To Hitler, the Major Martin letters were a gift from destiny. He was so convinced of his own brilliance in uncovering the plot that he began to reorganize the entire defensive structure of Southern Europe based on the dreams of a man who had never existed. The strategic fallout from Hitler's belief in the Mincemeat files was nothing short of a military disaster for the Axis. Acting on the Führer's direct orders, the German High Command began a massive, frantic redeployment of their most elite forces. The 1st Panzer Division, a powerhouse of steel and experienced veterans, was ordered to leave its positions in France and endure a grueling week-long rail journey across the continent to the mountains of Greece, territory where tanks were practically useless. Torpedo boat flotillas were moved from the vital ports of Sicily to the Aegean Sea. Minefields were laid along Greek beaches that would never see an Allied landing craft. Thousands of tons of concrete and steel were diverted to build fortifications in the Balkans, while the defenses on Sicily remained neglected and undermanned. Hitler even sent his favorite commando, Otto Scarzeni, to Greece to organize partisan resistance against an invasion that wasn't coming. By the time the deception had run its course, Hitler had effectively neutralized his own best units. He had been tricked into defending a phantom, leaving the back door to his Fortress Europe unlocked and unguarded. The soft underbelly of Europe wasn't just soft, it was now completely exposed. As the summer of 1943 approached, the German war machine was chasing ghosts. Intelligence reports from the Mediterranean were now being filtered through the lens of the mincemeat deception. When Allied ship movements were spotted near North Africa, German analysts ignored them, convinced they were part of the Sicily feint mentioned in the letters. The Germans had become so invested in the lie that they began to ignore the reality unfolding before their eyes. They punchinelli underestimated the sheer scale of the Allied deception network, which included fake radio traffic, dummy paratrooper drops, and even phantom armies in North Africa. The British and Americans were playing a symphony of misinformation, and Major Martin was the lead conductor.
Even when Italian intelligence, who lived in the region, insisted that Sicily was the true target, Berlin dismissed them as panicky and unreliable. This was the peak of Nazi hubris, the belief that their captured documents were more real than the thousands of ships actually gathering in the Mediterranean harbors. Hitler had built a fortress of cards, and the first gust of reality was about to blow it all down.
On the night of July 9, 1943, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point began to unfold. Not in Greece, but on the rocky shores of Sicily. Operation Husky had begun. As thousands of paratroopers dropped into the darkness and the horizon filled with the silhouettes of nearly 3,000 ships, the German response was paralyzed by confusion. Even as the first reports of the massive landings reached Hitler's headquarters, the ghost of Major Martin still haunted the room. Hitler remained convinced for several critical days that the Sicily landings were merely a diversion, a secondary attack, designed to draw his forces away from the real invasion of Greece. He refused to release the elite reserves he had moved to the Balkans, waiting for an enemy that would never arrive. This delay was a gift of gold to the Allied commanders, Patton and Montgomery. By the time the German High Command realized they had been played for fools, the Allied bridgeheads were secure, and the battle for Italy was already being lost. The dead man from London had achieved more in his silence than 1,000 cannons. He had frozen the German army in place at the most decisive moment of the campaign.
The catastrophic failure of German intelligence in Operation Mincemeat was not merely a failure of information, it was a systemic collapse of military culture. Inside the Abwehr and the Secretdienst, a lethal environment of fear and sycophancy had taken root. In Hitler's Germany, providing objective intelligence was a secondary priority to providing intelligence that confirmed the Führer's existing prejudices. When the Major Martin documents arrived, they created a perfect storm of confirmation bias. The German analysts who looked at the letters saw exactly what they wanted to see, a British military that was disorganized, careless, and exactly as inferior as Nazi ideology claimed. This created a dangerous echo chamber where any dissenting voice, any junior officer who pointed out that the corpse looked too fresh or that the letters were too convenient, was immediately silenced or accused of defeatism. The German intelligence apparatus Pazienilo underestimated the sheer psychological depth of the British plan. They failed to realize that the British weren't just faking a briefcase, they were exploiting the internal rot of the Nazi command structure. By the time the briefcase reached Hitler, it was no longer just a piece of evidence, it was a weapon of mass deception that fed the dictator's ego until he was blind to the thousands of Allied ships actually gathering on the horizon. The Germans hadn't just been outfought on the battlefield, they had been outthought in the very halls of their own intelligence headquarters. Perhaps the most striking evidence of the success of Mincemeat was the deployment of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated and capable tactical mind, was sent by Hitler to Greece to take command of Army Group E. Rommel, a man who thrived on rapid movement and feeling the battlefield, found himself counting rocks and inspecting empty beaches in the Balkans. While his fellow generals in Sicily were being pulverized by Allied naval gunfire and overwhelmed by superior numbers, Rommel was stuck in a strategic vacuum. He spent his time planning for a battle that was a total fiction. Had Rommel and his elite panzer reinforcements been present in Sicily on D-Day, the Allied landings might have been pushed back into the sea. The Major Martin deception hadn't just moved tanks, it had moved the Reich's best brain away from the fight. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The British had neutralized Germany's greatest general without firing a single bullet. Rommel's absence from the front lines in Italy was a wound that the Axis forces could never hope to heal. The speed with which Sicily fell sent shockwaves through the Axis alliance that Berlin never expected.
In just over 5 weeks, the invincible fortress had crumbled, and with it, the political stability of Italy. The rapid Allied advance, made possible by the absence of German reinforcements, led directly to a palace coup in Rome. Benito Mussolini, Hitler's oldest ally, was arrested and stripped of power. The Italian government began secret surrender negotiations almost immediately. For Hitler, this was a nightmare scenario. His southern flank was collapsing, and he was forced to drain even more divisions from the Eastern Front to occupy Italy and prevent a total Allied breakthrough. All of this chaos, all of this strategic ruin could be traced back to the briefcase of a dead man. The mincemeat deception had acted as a catalyst, accelerating the collapse of the Axis in the Mediterranean and forcing the Germans into a two-front war they could not win. The Nazi leadership had been so focused on their own superior intelligence that they had failed to see the most basic rule of war: never trust a gift from the sea.
The true brilliance of Operation Mincemeat lay in its long-term psychological effects. After the war, it was discovered that the German intelligence community was shattered by the realization of how badly they had been fooled. They became a house divided by paranoia. For the remainder of the war, whenever the Germans captured secret Allied plans, they were paralyzed by doubt. Was it real, or was it another Major Martin? This mincemeat hangover was a major factor during the D-Day landings in Normandy a year later. When the Allies launched Operation Fortitude to trick Hitler into thinking the invasion would happen at the Pas-de-Calais, the Germans were even more susceptible to the lie. They had been burned so badly in Sicily that their judgment was permanently warped. Hitler's refusal to admit he had been deceived meant that the Reich never corrected its intelligence-gathering flaws. They continued to underestimate the creativity and the ruthlessness of their enemies, remaining trapped in a cycle of arrogance and error that would eventually lead them to the ruins of Berlin. In the end, the story of Operation Mincemeat is the story of how a nameless, forgotten man became the most successful soldier of the 20th century. Glindworm Michael, the homeless man who died in despair in a London warehouse, was buried in Spain with full military honors as Major William Martin. He is perhaps the only soldier in history whose greatest contribution to victory happened after his death. His headstone in Huelva now bears his true name, but his legacy is written in the lives of the thousands of Allied soldiers who survived the beaches of Sicily because the German guns were pointed in the wrong direction. The operation remains the gold standard of military deception, a perfect example of how an enemy's greatest strength, their pride and their certainty, can be turned into their greatest weakness. As we look back at the maps of 1943, we see a German empire that thought it had conquered the world, but in reality, it had been conquered by a love letter, a photograph of a girl named Pam, and a dead man who proved that in war, the most powerful weapon is the truth that the enemy chooses to believe.